everyone. Today we are going to be looking at the first complex societies and social inequality. This is what we also call the urban revolution. So we are looking in our first lecture, actually, we spoke about an egalitarian society, a hunter-gatherer society that does not rank anyone socially above each other. So in these hunter-gatherer societies, there was minimal social roles. People were equal in the eyes of each other. I'm sure you remember this. There were low populations, keeping the birth rate low to a limit. This would limit starvation or stress on resources. And if you remember, people moved around and they did not produce or store any food. So these were the earliest forms of social organization. Also from our previous lecture, we looked at the Middle East. You can see the map in front of you is a map of the Fertile Crescent that begins in the Nile Delta region. It goes through Jordan and Syria, southeastern Turkey down to Mesopotamia towards the Persian Gulf. So the Fertile Crescent changes through time. Over time, we saw hunter-gatherers gather around the Fertile Crescent. Then the hunter-gatherers developed tools during the Stone Age. And then there was increased sedentism. There was elaborate housing, larger communities, and communal food storage begins. So the farming communities in Southwestern Asia that produced surplus food had grown into villages, right? And then 12,000 BC, villages develop at the sites like Ain Malan, which was northeast Israel, in places like Jericho and other places. They start off with round huts, and then we see now things transitioning from foraging to farming. And then people begin to organize themselves differently, and larger settlements at sites like Jericho. There are new forms of leadership that arise from the agricultural revolution that we did. For example, there's also chieftainships, what they also called big men. That system arose with some individuals or lineages enjoying much more greater prestige than others, right? So this would mean permanent positions, ranks, and authority, right? And high levels of political organization than the hunter-gatherer groups that we had looked at. So now we are going to leave the Neolithic behind and turn our attention to the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, which now constitutes part of modern Iraq, Syria, and southeastern Turkey. We see the emergence of complex societies during the 17th millennial BC. So we're going to first look at the definition of a complex society. So a complex society is a concept that is shared by a range of disciplines, including anthropology, archaeology, history, and sociology, to describe a stage of social formation. The concept was formulated by scholars attempting to understand how modern states emerged, specifically the transition from kin-based societies to large hierarchically structured societies. Now we're going to look at characteristics of complex societies. The characteristics include the development of cities, the development of a state with a large population. The economy is structured according to specialization and the division of labor. So the population engages in jobs and professions away from growing food, right? Social class hierarchy emerges and there's institutionalized inequality. So now the farmers and the laborers are at the bottom, those with special skills are at the middle, and a small privileged elite are at the top, the priests and the kings. And then we also see monumental architecture. There's large-scale agricultural development, which leads to specialized skill sets. There's organized political organization and the state. There's now an accumulation of knowledge, writing, science, the development of things like astronomy, geometry. We also see the emergence of long-distance trade, and there's art. When we look at, we're going to look at a place called Mesopotamia. So the name Mesopotamia came from the Greek, which means between two rivers. Mesopotamia is the world's oldest known civilization that was located in Iraq and Syria between the Tigris and Euphrates River. The source of land between the river Tigris and Euphrates became the cradle of several civilizations, thanks to its fertility. Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians all thrived there in different stages of history. Now, the dictionary defines civilization as the stage of human social and cultural development and organization that is considered most advanced. So the way humans have organized themselves, okay? So Mesopotamia had fertile land. It had an incredible water supply. The river enabled easy farming and irrigation. So Mesopotamia is considered the first urban civilization. By civilization, we mean people living in what? In cities. The change is called the urban revolution. The people of Mesopotamia were living closely to each other with socio-economic structures. They settled down. This led to small groups forming villages and later cities. So other complex societies that arose independently in these other areas were in China, the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mexico, and Peru. So a complex society comes with complex monuments. So the development of agricultural communities resulted in the formation of more complex societies, right? So in the image before us, we have an image of a temple from the Maya world. There is a similar type of temple, the ziggurats of Southwest Asia. These temples were built by people who lived a rural lifestyle. Humans transported and carved up huge rocks to make these temples. Etemenanki, this was the name of the large temple tower in Babylon, also known as the Tower of Babel. Its Sumerian name is Etemenanki, means house of the foundation of heaven on earth. It was a massive ziggurat dedicated to Marduk in ancient Babylon. So a ziggurat is a form of monumental architecture originating in ancient Mesopotamia, which usually had a rectangular base and was built in a series of steps up to a flat platform upon which a temple was raised. The ziggurat was an artificial mountain raised for the worship of the gods. They elevated the priests towards heaven. The ancient Babylonians called these brick mountains as ziguratu, or ziggurat, which can be translated to literally rising building. So this type of temple tower is the Oriental equivalent of the Egyptian pyramid, and just as old One of the differences is that the ziggurats did not have a tomb. No, we know the Egyptian pyramids had tombs in them. So it took a significant amount of social labor and organization to create these temples. It took masses of people to construct these temples. So the organization of labor on a large scale shows how complex and organized these societies had become. There had to be someone in charge to direct labor and focus it. You can imagine when building these extraordinary, huge monuments, you have to have someone directing labor and focusing labor in this area and that area. So the key role of these temples was to accumulate and redistribute wealth among society. There were food repositories, food was stored there. The religious ceremonies took place. Rites and rituals were reinforced. There was social organization and also the emergence of taxation. So we are going to look at the rise of Uruk, which happened 6500 BC to 3200 BC. So this was in southern Mesopotamia, 3300 BC. So Uruk is one of the world's first states, competing with ancient Egypt for the definitive answer of the oldest. Uruk is said to be the first city in the history of civilization. The settlement was on the banks of the Euphrates River, a settlement larger than any the world has known. Uruk produced the first of many things. The first poem, which was called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written story on earth. It comes to us from ancient Sumeria and was originally written on 12 clay tablets in cuneiform script. It is about the adventures of the historical king of Uruk, somewhere between 2750 and 2500 BCE. So I will read to you a piece in the first tablet. Who knows, you might end up falling apart, you might end up falling in love with ancient poetry after I read the poem to you. I have uploaded a link to all the ancient tablets, to all 12 of them, should you want to go through all of them during your own time if you are interested in this type of poetry that was written back then. Okay, so the first tablet that was written, the first poem of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written by the king. So he who has seen everything, I will make known to the lands. I will teach about him who experienced all things alike. Anu granted him the totality of knowledge of all. He saw the secret, discovered the hidden. He brought information of the time before the flood. He went on a distant journey, pushing himself into exhaustion. But then he was brought to peace. He carved on a stone stela all of his toils and built the wall of Uruk Haven, the wall of the sacred inner temple, the holy sanctuary. Look at its wall, which gleams like copper. Inspect its inner wall, the likes of which no one can equal. Take hold of the threshold stone, it dates from ancient times. Go close to the inner temple, the residence of Ishtar, such as no later king or man ever equaled. Go up to the wall of Uruk and walk around. Examine its foundation, inspect its brickwork thoroughly. Even the core of the brick structure made of kiln-fired brick. And did not the seven sages themselves lay out its plans? 1 league city, 1 league palm garden, 1 league lowland, the open area of the Ishtar temple, 3 leagues, and the open area of Uruk, the walls encloses. Find the copper tablet box, open the of its lock of bronze, undo the fastening of its secret opening. Take and read out from the lapis lazuli tablets how Gilgamesh went through every hardship, supreme over other kings, lordly in appearance. He is the hero born of Uruk, the goring wild bull. He walks out in front, the leader, and walks at the rear, trusted by his companions, mighty net protector of his people, raging flood wave who destroy even walls of stone, offspring of Lugabanda. Gilgamesh is strong to perfection, son of the ox cow, Rimat Ninsan. Gilgamesh is awesome to perfection. It was he who opened the mountain passes, who dug wells on the flank of the mountain. It was he who crossed the ocean, the vast seas to the rising sun, who explored the world's region seeking life. It is he who reached by his own sheer strength Uttanapatan, the faraway, who restored the sanctuaries or cities that the flood had destroyed. For teeming mankind, who can compare himself to kingliness? Who can say Gilgamesh, I am king? Whose name from the day of his birth was called Gilgamesh? 2/3 of him God, 1/3 of him is human. The great goddess Arura designed a model of his body. She separated his form, beautiful, handsomest of men, perfect. He walks around in the enclosure of Uruk. Like a wild bull, he makes himself mighty, head raised over others. There is no rival who can raise his weapon against him. His fellows stand at the alert, attentive to his orders. And then the men of Uruk become anxious. In Gilgamesh does not leave a son to his father. Day and night he is arrogant. So the following lines are interpreted as rhetorical, perhaps spoken by the oppressed people of Uruk, but you can hear from the poem that Gilgamesh is painted out to be almost like a god. But keep these words of the poem in mind as we unpack this lecture further. So in Uruk, this is where writing took off. The first examples of larger stone architectural work, this is where we see it in Uruk. For example, the ziggurats, a pyramid-like temple characteristic of Mesopotamia. Okay, so the origins of Uruk, which is slide 12. So Uruk is in modern South Iraq. Uruk thrived in the southern Mesopotamian plains crossed by rivers and canals. So the city of Uruk began life as a couple of Ubaid villages around 5000 BC. So like other settlements of the period, they were centered around relatively large temple complexes, one devoted to Anu, heaven, god of the sky, and one to Inanna, lady of heaven, the goddess of love. Over time, the growth of these villages would cause them to fuse into a single enormous city, which by roughly 3100 BC was home to a staggering 40,000 people. So the population specializes as Uruk grew. So what this means is that Uruk grew something changed in the way that people were making a living. So the population specialized. Not everyone now needed to work in the fields, because you remember at the beginning, everyone is working on the fields in our other previous lecture, agricultural revolution. So everyone is so now not everyone needed to work on the fields now. Some people were free from that work and needed to coordinate activities. So food now needed to be stored and supervised. So now we see that the concentration of craft production in the urban centers and of food production in the villages meant that the larger settlements could no longer depend on their own population for the production of food, and so began taking part of the surplus product from the surrounding villages. So upon this dramatic shift in the social division of labor arose the earliest separation of town and country. This is important for the development of class society. So in each community, one household would emerge with administrative control over the storage grain, through which they may have derived their local power. The individuals in the household were most likely linked to the temple's administration, given the building role as a distribution center. And this is where you will find the early priests of Mesopotamian society. So in addition to the surplus product, the temple bureaucracy also laid claim to the surplus labor time of the mass of the population. So in Uruk, we see the direct control and exploitation of labor on a mass scale. There's things are no longer being done through the old communal structures of the village and the family, but by a distinct class standing above and usurping the commune. Usurping means to seize and to hold in position by force or without any right. So as Uruk grew, the pre-existing village lands continued to be managed under the old family system. However, the extension of irrigation projects carried out by corvée, forced unpaid labor, which is forced unpaid labor. So labor under the direction of the temple had created virgin, which is available arable land, to which no family or village could lay claim. So new lands now were assigned to the temple. Over time, parts of these temple lands were assigned to individuals in return for services rendered to the city. Naturally, these individuals came from where? The ruling elite. So the old communal order disappearing in Uruk, that's what we're going to look at now. So the citizens of Uruk did not all benefit equally from the surplus extracted from the villages. The temple held exclusive control over the surplus product, and it was appropriating a greater and greater share for what? Itself. What was not consumed by the temple bureaucracy was stored, distributed, and traded under its control. So this created an underclass of people without the means to support themselves. So this pushed those who were unable to pay into debt. Those who failed to pay their debts could be enslaved by their creditors along with their wives and children. So in the late Uruk period, we begin to see evidence of the employment of widows and orphans as a form of servile labor, producing textiles in workshops attached to the temple. So the product of these workshops would then be traded, sometimes across long distances, in return for sought after goods such as copper and obsidian. So Uruk was also the first to have cylinder seals, which were later used throughout Mesopotamia. They were used for designated personal property and to apply signature on documents. It represents identity and ownership. So a cylinder-shaped seal could be rolled on a variety of objects made of clay. When seals were impressed on tablets or tablet cases, the seal impression served to identify the authority responsible for what was written in the documents, much as a signature would do today. These seals protected private property, so seals were also associated with the protection of ownership. They would notarize or authorize legal transactions, contracts, loans, and treaties. So the sealing in the late Uruk showed the monitoring of production and the feeding of labor pool who produced commodities. So we also see things like the counting of capital investments, such as animals on the hoof, and the deposition of grain in the granary. So the White Temple and the inner precinct. So Uruk contained two main temple areas, the White Temple and the inner precinct. So the White Temple was dedicated, at least in later times, to the worship of the sky god Anu, as he was later called by the Akkadians. The other to his daughter Inanna, the goddess of fertility, sex, and war. Inanna was Uruk's most prominent patron deity. On the image, you can see the ruins of the temples in front of you. So when the city of Uruk was first excavated in the mid-19th century, it was found to be split in half with one section walled off. So the division of the ancient city, now known as Waka in modern-day Iraq, was once considered the most important in ancient Mesopotamia. It represented a marker between two districts, the Anu and the Ina. The Anu district was the oldest section of the two and dedicated to the sky god Anu. The Ina district, the walled-off one, was dedicated to Inanna, the Sumerian god of love, fertility, and eventually war. So the White Temple created a visual effect of monumentality. These temples played a major significance on the changes they had on society. There was the emergence of an elite with tremendous control over the workforce. The buildings imply an institutionalized hierarchy. In the Anu ziggurat, there is clear evidence of altars and burnt offering pedestal. In those of the inner precinct, there is a complex design of interior niches that may have served both decorative and ritualistic functions. So the coordination of labor and advancement in tools increased productivity, generating a huge surplus of food and labor. The surplus was reinvested by the palace or temple into society. This allowed the society to build infrastructure, to build defenses, and to trade. There was again the specialization. This also differentiated human activities. People were freed of producing food to develop into new classes of administrators. And this, as you can imagine, grew more complex as a group of people would focus on infrastructure now in society and other areas. The palace collected taxes. So as you can see, society was changing. The food being produced required storage space, as we said. The citizens of Uruk perfected the making of ceramic artifacts, which were used to store food. To keep track of the surplus that was placed in the temples, the priests would make signs on the clay tablets we spoke about. It would record food going in and out of the temple. Now we're going to look at human social relations and how they changed. So the new way of living created first-time class divisions. There was a privileged minority who lived off the work of others. The priests became corrupt. They acted like gods. They took what they wanted, for example, land, cattle, and servants. They would take from the poor. They exploited the environment. Humans controlled the means of production. The means of production of a society include all the physical elements aside from human beings that go into producing goods and services. So for this context, it would be the natural resources, tools, means of distribution. The workers were in close relationship with the resources and the tools. So there was surplus wealth, there was a growing population. A rise in population needed what? New institutions to manage these relations among individuals and groups who lived close to each other. So the state sought to regulate human behavior on a larger scale now. So religious ideas became systematized. There was writing, but only a limited amount of people had access to that, and a limited amount of people achieved literacy. So now the next area we're going to look at is ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt empire stretched as far as modern Syria and as far as Sudan. So long before it was an empire, ancient Egypt was a series of small independent city-states that bloomed along the Nile River. So the city-states were divided into two regions and named according to the flow of the Nile. So there was Upper Egypt in the south, which was upstream, and then there was Lower Egypt in the north, which was downstream. So looking at the image, you can zoom in into the image. Looking at the image, you will see that in prehistoric time, Egypt was divided into two halves, Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt was in the south, while Lower Egypt was in the north, and this was due to the direction of the Nile. So the areas in green show us the habitable regions of Egypt, and note the locations of the Nile Delta, Upper and Lower Egypt, and also you see the Sinai Peninsula and Kush. So each region had its own king, and these kings fought with each other. The fighting eventually led to the unification of the two lands into a single Egypt around about 3100 BC. So they formed one Egyptian state that lasted for millennia. This launched a new era known as the early dynastic period. So the reign of this civilization can be divided into three major periods of prosperity: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. There were two periods of instability, which are usually called the first and the second intermediate. So the term intermediate here refers to the fact that during these times, Egypt was not a unified political power and was in between powerful, there was fighting in between the two powerful kingdoms. So even before the Old Kingdom period, the foundation of Egyptian civilization were being laid for thousands of years, as people living near the Nile increasingly focused on sedentary agriculture, which led to urbanization, and they specialized, and there was agricultural economic activity. Okay, so the next slide. So evidence of human habitation in Egypt stretches back to tens of thousands of years. It was only in about 6000 BCE. However, that widespread settlement began in the region. So around this time, the Sahara Desert expanded. Some scientists think this expansion was caused by a slight shift in the tilt of the Earth. Others have explored changing rainfall patterns, but the specific causes are not entirely clear. The most important result of this expansion of the Sahara for human civilization was that it pushed humans closer to the Nile River in search of reliable water sources. So after political unification, divine kinship, or the idea that a political ruler held his power by a favor of a god or gods, and that he was a living incarnation of a god, this became firmly established in Egypt. So, for example, in the mythology that developed around unification, Nama was portrayed as Horus, a god of Lower Egypt, when Nama originally ruled. He conquered Seth, and Seth was the god of Upper Egypt. This mythologized version of actual political events added legitimacy to the king's ruling. So, guiding the Egyptian people was a succession of about 300 rulers called pharaohs. So pharaoh, what does the word pharaoh mean? It actually means the great house. So in ancient Egyptian, it was never the ruler's formal title. It was used during the modern times, and it is linked to its use in the Hebrew Bible. The rulers were considered protectors of the people. They served a divine liaison between humanity and the gods they worshipped. So after these ancient Egyptians passed away, they believed that they would become gods. So to prepare for this journey for the afterlife, the pharaoh would prepare elaborate tombs, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, and underground tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They would fill the tombs with all the things they would need in the afterlife. This would include things like gold, jewelry, food, drink, and even things like pets. So the bodies of the pharaohs would be mummified, wrapped in linen, and placed in a tomb. So the pyramids are a testament of the role that religion played in the Egyptian lives. They also represent the innovative cultural might of the Egyptians. So innovation in mathematics and language. So mathematics and language propelled that civilization to go further and become successful. So measurement mathematics helped the Egyptians understand and harness the world like no civilization before. They developed a new form of measurement called the cubit. It was used to design massive structures such as the Great Pyramid of Giza. They were also able to measure time. They created a solar calendar, which was the first dating system in history to feature 365 days in a year. So Egyptians developed methods to measure and survey land around the Nile River. This civil engineering made way for the construction of dams, canals, and irrigation systems that helped farming and agriculture to flourish in the Nile Valley. Now we're going to look at hieroglyphic writing. The ancient Egyptians also created written languages to describe the world around them. The oldest, most well-known is hieroglyphic writing. This was developed 3150 BC during the Old Kingdom and has over 700 pictorial characters. So it was used to inscribe monuments and pottery and ceremonial practices. As the Egyptian state grew in power and influence, it was better able to mobilize resources for larger scale projects and required better methods of record keeping to organize and manage an increasingly large state. So soon after that, another form of writing developed called hieratic. So during the Middle Kingdom, Egyptians began to write literature as well. Some writing was preserved on stone or clay, and some was preserved on papyrus, a paper-like product made from reed fiber. Papyrus was very fragile, but due to the hot and dry climate of Egypt, a few papyrus documents had survived. So hieroglyphic writing also became an important tool for historians studying ancient Egypt once it was translated in the early 1800s. So here we have an image of hieroglyphic writing. So it is easy to think that these were little pictures of people, animals, and objects. It is easy to assume that hieroglyphics represent those things. Instead, some hieroglyphics signify actually signify sound in ancient Egyptian language, just as the characters in the Roman alphabet do. Others are ideographic signs, which represent concepts but do not have a sound attached. So, because hieroglyphic writing was so complicated, the ancient Egyptians developed other types of writing that were more convenient. Hieratic writing was a cursive script that was written on papyrus with a pen or a brush, or upon a piece of limestone called an ostracon, which was invented for use primarily on papyrus, a more fragile material. And then demotic was another form of writing that was developed in the 800s BC. It was used for everyday documents as well as for literary works. So now, in front of us, this is an image of the Rosetta Stone that was discovered in 1799, and it featured writings in three different scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek. So you're probably wondering, huh? Ancient Greek, where does this fit in? So now, Ptolemy, who was of Macedonian descent, began his rule in Egypt in the 300s BC. So now the Greek replaced Egyptians as the official court language. In 322 BC, Alexander the Great invaded Egypt with an army of Macedonians and Greeks. So now the Egyptians saw Alexander as a liberator, and he took the country actually without even a battle. So now when we look at Egyptian rule, as rulers became more powerful, they were better able to what? We said they were able to coordinate labor and resources to construct these major projects, and more people required larger supplies of food. So projects to improve agricultural productions, such as levees and canals, became more important. Irrigation practices consist of building mud levees, which were walls of compacted dirt that directed the annual flooding into farmland and kept it away from the living areas, and of digging canals to direct the water to fields of crops they were growing. Now, the elites, those individuals who were wealthy and powerful, began building larger tombs, which were precursors to the pyramids. The tombs represented a growing divide between the elite and the common people in Egyptian society. Now, only the wealthy and the important could then afford these elaborate tombs and could be considered of deserving of such elaborate burials. So when we look at the Old Kingdom rulers, during the Old Kingdom period, Egypt was largely unified as a single state. It gained in complexity and expanded its military. The Old Kingdom rulers built the first pyramids, which were both tombs and monuments for the kings who had built them. So building monumental architecture such as the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx of Giza and the temples for different gods, this required centralized government that could command vast resources. We can see in the image here, the image of the Great Sphinx of Giza and the Pyramid of Khafre. So the builders of the pyramids were not enslaved people but peasants working on pyramids during the farming off-season. But this went on to not only include peasants, it included farmers and slaves who were involved in building such structures as pyramids and palaces. Slavery became the fate of those captured as prisoners of war. In addition to being forced to work on building projects, slaves toiled at the discretion of the pharaohs or the nobles. So these peasants worked alongside specialists such as stone cutters, mathematicians, and priests. As a form of taxation, each household was required to provide a worker for these projects, although the wealthy could actually pay for a substitute, which is quite unfair. So then this now demonstrates both the power of the state to force people to provide labor and also the advantages enjoyed by the elites who could buy their way out of providing labor. So Egyptians also began to build things like ships. Which were constructed of wooden planks tied together with ropes and stuffed with reeds, to trade goods such as ebony, incense, gold, copper, and Lebanese cedar, which was particularly important for the construction of projects along maritime routes. So ancient Egypt was actually a society built on brutality, inequality, and corruption. So ancient Egypt is a story, yes, of glory, of political power, of wealth, but also of wealth being monopolized by a tiny elite. So the Egyptian elite directed resources towards the building of magnificent temples that were built to the gods who supposedly backed their power. So this is why they claimed to be connected directly to the gods. The temples were built to glorify the regime. The ruling class built these monumental buildings or towers. The pyramids of Giza or Teotihuacan, the ziggurats of Ur or Uruk reinforced feelings of power, and this also reinforced feelings of powerlessness amongst the masses. So ancient Egypt had three main social classes: the upper, the middle, and the lower class. The upper class consisted of the royal family, rich landowners, government officials, important priests, and army officers and doctors. The middle class was made up of chiefly merchants, manufacturers, and artisans. And the lower class, the largest class by far, consisted of unskilled laborers. Most of them worked on farms. Also, prisoners captured in foreign wars became slaves and formed a separate class. So most ancient Egyptians were on the poverty line, while a handful of priest kings held fabulous wealth. Children earned their keep from a very young age, and 2 out of every 3 people in an average family had to work. So now we're going to look at the Egyptian social structure. So in the social pyramid of ancient Egypt, the pharaoh and those associated with divinity were right at the top, and the servants of slaves were made at the bottom. So Egyptian society was structured like a pyramid. At the top were the gods such as Ra, Osiris, Isis. The Egyptians believed that the gods controlled the universe. Therefore, it was important to keep them happy. They could make the Nile overflow, the gods could cause famine, or even bring death. The Egyptians also elevated now some humans to being gods. The leaders called pharaohs, who believed to be gods in human form, they had absolute power over their subjects. After pharaohs died, huge stone pyramids were built as their tombs. Pharaohs were buried in chambers within the pyramids. Now, how the Egyptian system was managed. The pharaohs appointed a chief minister called a vizier as a supervisor. The vizier ensured that taxes were collected. Now, each farmer paid taxes in the form of grain, which was stored in the pharaoh's warehouse. Working with the vizier were scribes who kept government records. These high-level employees had mastered a rare skill in ancient Egypt. They could read and write. Right below the pharaoh in status were powerful nobles and priests. Only nobles could hold government posts. In these positions, they profited from tributes paid to the pharaoh. Priests were responsible for pleasing the gods. The nobles ensured the nobles enjoyed the great status and grew wealthy from donations of the gods. All the Egyptians, from pharaohs to farmers, gave gifts to the gods. So farmers tended the fields, they raised the animals, kept canals and reservoirs in good order, worked in the stone quarries, and built the royal monuments. Farmers paid taxes that could be as much as 60% of their yearly harvest. That is a lot. A small number of peasants and farmers moved up the economic ladder. Families saved money to send their sons to the village schools to learn trades. These schools were run by priests or by artisans. Boys learned to read and write. Those who learned how to read and write could actually become scribes, then go on to gain employment in the government. So it was possible for a boy living on a farm to work his way up into the higher ranks of the government. So next, we are going to be looking at the rise of women's oppression. So when society became divided into classes, there was a shift in the status of women. Women moved into subordinate positions and positions of dependence. So this varied from class to class across society, but it existed where class existed. So in ancient Egypt, however, something differed. Social dignity was not based on gender, but rather on social status. This means that women held many important and influential positions in ancient Egypt and typically enjoyed many of the legal and economic rights given to the men within their respective social class. Unlike in other ancient societies, women in Egypt had a higher degree of equal opportunities and of freedom. Ancient Egyptian women and men were somewhat equal, firmly equal. Interestingly, ancient sources indicate that women were qualified to sue and obtain contracts incorporating any lawful settlements such as marriage, separation, property, and jobs. Some of these rights were not given to women in modern Egypt, though. So in Uruk, the place of the woman was an equal producer within the family. So the place of the woman as an equal producer within the family was degraded and she became slave to the man. Women had no say over productive means. So now in the city, wages or lands were conferred to individual craftsmen, your priests, your nobles, who were always male. In the countryside, cereal cultivation using the ox-drawn plow was likewise an exclusively male occupation. So the use of the plow caused a division of labor between men and women, since the plow was heavy labor. The women were reduced to just having children and being subordinate wives. They were not protected against abusive treatment. The rise of inheritance through the male line left women entirely dependent on husbands or male relatives. If the husband died, the woman would go to work at the temple, expanding the wealth of the ruling class. So women in the agricultural household still had productive roles and had to work hard in both classes. It had to work hard, but in both classes, the men controlled the production and relations between the household and society. And you can see that this is patriarchy. The fathers ruled over the households, therefore patriarchy was in other ideologies too, even in religion, it expanded into other ideologies too within the society. So we can see that class oppression coincides with women's oppression. Now we're going to look at how Karl Marx explains everything we have just learned. So who was Karl Marx is the first question. So Karl Marx was a German philosopher during the 19th period. He worked primarily in the realm of political philosophy and was a famous advocate for communism. He co-wrote the Communist Manifesto and was the author of Das Kapital, which together formed the basis of Marxism. So we need to ask ourselves, why did people who had not previously been exploited and oppressed, why had people who had not previously exploited and oppressed others suddenly start to do so? And why did the rest of society put up with this new exploitation and oppression? So Karl Marx states that in primitive communism, which is the hunter-gatherer way of life, people were bound by natural constraints, but socially very equal. Now compare that to the first complex societies where we have an entire class of people, the elite who never had to spend time worrying about where their next meal comes from, and the peasantry who spend time constantly making food and starving. So they spend a lot of time producing food for the elite. People were producing more than they needed to survive, but instead of that surplus being equally distributed, it was not. So, okay. So some people were not laboring at all while others had to work hard. The way labor is organized, we can see that the way labor has been organized, it changes and it leads to massive inequalities. So to understand labor, we need to look at how labor is organized, who it benefits, and how this organization changes over time. This focus on labor gave rise to the perspective created by Marx and Engels called historical materialism. So historical materialism looks at changes over time, and it's materialism because it's concerned with the question of material reality. That is how production is organized, who has the resources and who does not, the production and the control of resources. So now we have the economy, the organization of labor and resources in the society, which is the foundation of the society, in the societies we looked at. We look at politics, culture, and religion and families. That was what Marx called now the superstructure, which was built on top of material reality. So when Marx studied history, he saw historical development in terms of modes of production and economic classes. So modes of production, he looked at them as stages of history. So primitive communism, agricultural revolution, first complex societies. So these modes of production are all defined by a combination of forces of production and relations of production. So forces of production are the technical, scientific, material parts of the economy, the tools, buildings, material resources, technology, and human labor. The relations of productions define how people organize themselves around labor. Do people work for wages or are they unpaid? How does ownership and property work? Is trade part of the economy? And keeping in mind what we just learned in the previous slides. So these are all questions about the relations of productions These questions are important. The relations of production tell us how the surplus is taken from the people who produced it, the farmers, and who gets to decide how the surplus is used, the elite and the priests. So Marx puts the stress on the interaction between the development of relations of production and the forces of production. So you have a new way of producing things. What does this do? It creates new relations between the members of a group. So some things change in the way people are making a livelihood. We see that classes arose. Not everyone can work in the fields like they did in the primitive communism hunter-gatherer. In the agricultural revolution, we see that not everyone can work together in the fields. So what happens? Some people become, in the complex society, some people become free from working on the fields, and their specialization and activities are coordinated. Food needs to be stored and supervised. There is control over resources. The leaders become the rulers. So the change in production methods lead to people becoming self-interested, and they exploit others, what the priests do. So new technologies arise, lead to a rising of a ruling class. From here, the history of society becomes the history of class struggle. Humans increase their control over nature. They increase their control over other humans. People are exploited by the privileged minority. So we need to ask ourselves, why did these empires not last? So there are various explanations as to why these civilizations were abandoned or why they collapsed. The first one is wars. So with the dramatic increase in surplus product and its concentration in the temples, it became increasingly necessary for cities such as Uruk to erect walls and organize some form of military force, right? To repel against raids from nomadic tribes or herdmen or even other rival cities. So a side effect of war is economic disruption. We know this anyway, which itself is another catalyst to societal decline. When trading routes are lost or compromised by war, there's an economic downturn happens, which can put society under severe pressure, and this can lead to famine. The next thing is inequality and the centralization of power. So the population increased and the workers became cheap. The workers were exploited. This not only causes social distress within the society, but it handicaps a society's ability to respond to ecological, social, and economic problems. Spending by the ruling class and the elaborate lifestyles they were leading extracted more surplus from the cultivators. The elite were more concerned with the transfer of produce. There was poor maintenance of the agricultural system. So those in agriculture were still using Neolithic tools, but this put pressure on the agricultural surplus. The living standards of the masses declined, so there was stagnation of the means of providing a livelihood for society as a whole. The Sumerian kings and the Egyptian pharaohs claimed godlike powers for themselves, so they were preventing society from advancing further, and they were exhausting resources. This inequality undermines collective solidarity, and political turbulences follow. So the next point is climate change. So it is believed that the ancient Asian civilizations of the Akkadian Empire and the Indus Valley civilization declined due to drought brought about by extreme environmental changes. Agriculture is so dependent on the state of the climate. So crop failure would then lead to widespread food shortages and the onset of famine. And the next thing is environmental degradation. So when the environment is overexploited and impoverished, life-sustaining natural resources that people and society depend on are less abundant. The eventual strain leads to either widespread chaos or mass migration as people leave in search of resources. Either way, societal collapse is most likely to happen. For example, the Maya of South America was the most sophisticated and highly developed civilization in pre-Columbian Americas, reaching its peak around the 16th century AD. However, in 900 AD, most of the great Maya cities had been mysteriously abandoned. A multitude of theories have been presented by historians as to why the Maya ceased to exist so abruptly. One is deforestation and soil erosion caused by intensive agriculture. The dissemination of the countryside resulted in diminishing resources, which, coupled with the pressure of things like war and climate change, would lead to mass desertion of the large cities. The last thing is disease. So history tells us that the dawn of agriculture was the turning point in the rise of contagious diseases, right? So as humans and cattle began living in close proximity, coupled with poor hygiene, outbreaks of infectious diseases became unavoidable. The consequences of these outbreaks were often catastrophic. An example includes the Spanish introducing Salmonella to the Americas and causing high mortality rates among the indigenous population. The Aztecs ruled a large empire during the 15th and the 16th century in what was now modern-day Mexico. They were brought to their knees by the Spanish and by European diseases such as smallpox that disseminated the local populations. So sometimes it is a combination of these explanations: war, natural disasters, famine, plague, the elaborate lifestyle that the Egyptian pharaohs lived. We need to have, we do not have a conclusive explanation as to why civilizations collapsed. What we do know is that the factors highlighted above can all contribute towards the collapse of a civilization. Collapse is a tipping point phenomenon which compounds when compounded stresses overrun societal coping capacities. Okay, so now what have we inherited from these societies? So we've inherited urban living, the state, social class hierarchies, writing, mathematics, and astronomy, institutionalized religion, transportation systems. Okay, so to conclude, the changes in agriculture that began before 7000 BC caused dramatic changes in society. So surplus food allowed farming settlements to grow into villages. Surpluses of food and other resources led to trade. With the surplus of food and trade, people developed more complex societies and economies. And we've seen the economies of these um, societies. The rise of complex societies is a key point in the evolution of human society. A class of priests and scribes centered around the temple held exclusive control over the production and the distribution of wealth of a society. So this class separated itself and became superior to the rest of society and propagated an ideology of rule that reflected their interests. This new ruling class acted like gods and looked out for their own self-interest. So we can see that history is a process by which human beings have created a society by working together. This this establishes certain relations between people. If you look through human history, each stage, there's a new way of cooperating with each other. You find new sets of social relations developing between people. We've seen that. So some people discovered that the way to further advance the means of creating a livelihood for one section of a society is to cut itself off from the other section of society, to take control therefore controlling nature and people. So once you have the division of people into classes, then something else develops over time, which is those who control the surplus. Those who have a better life than those ones will have a better life than those who are around them. Then we see the development of armed forces, which is the beginning of what? The state machine. So once you have a class, you have the ruling class. They systematically take control of the surplus, develop massive superstructures and monuments, glorifying its own power. Example, we saw that in the pyramids. The peasants are on the ground with the power that rules over them. Thank you for attending the lecture. Hope you enjoyed it.